Hello, I'm Pastor Paul Jehle, and I want to just bring you this short devotional and story of the Thanksgiving of 1621 that probably took place in October, and much history precedes it. But particularly, my focus today is on Colossians 3:15. It says, "Let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful." You see, this verse sets a pattern that if we have peace with God and peace with one another, then there will be unity, reconciliation between individuals. We can overcome our differences and we can unite. And it sets the greatest context for joyful thanksgiving. Christ is the one that brought us peace between God and man, and we are now reconciled to him. And we ought to have a heart of gratitude toward that. But it's an exhortation toward us, for others as well. The Bible tells us we ought to be peacemakers. We ought to be reconciled to our brothers and sisters, regardless of our differences. And then we can rejoice and be thankful. And this pattern actually happened in history. Of all times, during this time when such division and divisiveness appear there's so much that we might disagree on between us. Now we need to look back 400 years. 400 years ago, when the Pilgrims came, amazingly, this same pattern, identified in Scripture, of having peace, bringing reconciliation, and then thanksgiving, occurred in three separate events, two which immediately preceded that first harvest festival in October of 1621. You see, when the Pilgrims first came and arrived, they were under a different motivation than the doctrine of discovery, which had been out for hundreds of years, which taught that you would vanquish individuals, steal their land, and even commit genocide, make slaves, and then somehow evangelize. Well, they didn't come with that purpose. Their purpose was initially to make peace with the natives as early as possible and to give them satisfaction for the land and the resources that you would use, and live peaceably with them. And that's what the Pilgrims sought to do. It's interesting that by the time they had recovered, or half of them had died the first winter, that here they decided to begin their military orders for their defense, not knowing their neighbors. And that's when Samoset came boldly amongst them, speaking English. He told them of Squanto, who had been captured 6 years before, and taken as slaves with about 20 other braves out from Cape Cod. No wonder the Nausetts had fired upon them with their arrows when they first landed in self-defense. They had every right to do so. And now the Pilgrims had this opportunity to make peace. And soon, after about 2 or 3 contacts, Massasoit came with 90 braves or thereabouts. And what he tried to do was, many of those braves that came with him, the 90 would come later, they made peace. And the peace said that neither would hurt each other, that if anyone did, they would send the offender. In other words, a native would be governed by native law, the English by English law. Any tools that were stolen, you see, the Pilgrims had taken some corn off of Cape Cod, and the only way they could do that with their conscience was to determine to repay them out of necessity. And the natives had taken some tools they had seen were near the farming fields. And they said to return those things. And if anyone would unjustly war, the other would become an ally. And they would send to their neighbors, that Massasoit would send to their neighbors certificates that they had made peace now, that everyone would be able to dwell in peace in the land, which Massasoit did. And that whenever they would meet together, they would leave their weapons behind them at the door. That's a great idea for peace. To be self-governed, to not hurt one another, to not unnecessarily offend. In fact, John Robinson had made that the point of the Pilgrims. And we all, when we gather together for Thanksgiving on the phone with brothers and sisters, there's a time and place for disagreement and for discussion, but we ought to leave our weapons behind us and come in peace. This led to the fact that the Nauset, who had been affronted and had 20 or more of their braves taken, This led to them their self-defense against the Pilgrims. They didn't understand them, and the Pilgrims didn't know the others. Finally, when a boy had been taken by the Nauset, almost like a hostage, but unharmed, because remember that certificate of peace had come, that indeed the Pilgrims went and met with them on Cape Cod. When this happened, William Bradford reports this, but most likely Edward Winslow is writing this account from Mort's relation. He said this: "One thing was very grievous unto us at this place. There was an old woman who we judged to be no less than 100 years old, which came to see us because she never saw the English. Yet she could not behold us without breaking forth into great passion, weeping and crying excessively. We demanded the reason of it, and they told us she had 3 sons who, when Master Hunt was in these parts, went aboard his ship to trade with him, and he carried them captives into Spain. For Desquantum, which was Squanto, at that time was carried away also, by which means she was deprived of the company of her children in her old age. We told them we were sorry that any Englishman should give them that offense, that Hunt was a bad man, that all the English that heard of it condemned him for the same. But for us, we would not offer them any such injury, though it would gain us all the skins in the country. So we gave her some small trifles, which somewhat appeased her." But you see, it's imperative to know that this event that probably took place in August of 1621, a reconciliation, an apology on behalf of your race, would never have happened without peace. Peace led to an atmosphere for reconciliation. And then that harvest festival, probably in October of 1621. Edward Winslow's account is simple. It says, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl, as with a little help besides served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among their rest, their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And although it's not been always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." Here, that first harvest festival, which dates probably from a practice both in the Dutch and the English, it could go all the way back to biblical precedents, like the ingathering of the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall. There's no evidence that the Pilgrims did this directly from that feast. But here, they gathered together, some 90, minimally. There were only about 50 of the English still alive after that first winter, plus 90 men. That doesn't count maybe some women and children and others that came as guests. That was about 140. We don't know who invited whom, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is for 3 days, they fellowship. They were friendly competition. Think of it. Competition still goes on athletically around Thanksgiving today, but think of it this way, that competition could have been native versus English. Bow and arrow, I think the natives have it. Rifles, I think probably the English have it. Wrestling, who knows? But we recognize foot races, that would go to the natives. And Bradford never kept score. But you see, there was this friendly 3-day feasting, a harvest festival. It's interesting to know this, that all the dishes were wooden. The children served the adults. There were only 4 adult Pilgrim women left alive. Imagine having 140 guests, minimal. They ate cod, sea bass, fowl, wild turkey, and deer. Turkeys were a lot harder to catch then, running about 25 miles an hour. It's a good thing the natives brought most of the food. And I like the fact that there's a tradition, though it's not proven, that even the natives brought uncooked corn or putting it in a pot and it popped. That's where we might have gotten popcorn from the natives. The Pilgrims would have thanked God for all of this, thank God for the friendship, and they would have thanked the natives, because without Squanto and their help in planting corn, they probably never would have survived. And it's interesting that an anonymous poem that's given by Henry Morton Dexter in a book called The Songs of the Pilgrims in 1887, it's anonymous, I want to read it to you. It simply says this: we gathered in our harvests and stored the yellow grain, for God had sent the sunshine and sent the plenteous rain. Our barley land and corn land had yielded up their store, and the fear and dread of famine oppressed our homes no more. As the chosen tribes of Israel in the far years of old, when the summer fruits were garnered and before the winter's cold, kept their festal week with gladness, with songs and choral lays, so we kept our first Thanksgiving in the hazy autumn days. I exhort you this Thanksgiving. Think of peace. Think of being a peacemaker. Think of how that leads us, as Colossians 3:15 says, to being a reconciler, that we become one body. Pray for your brothers and sisters. Pray for your neighbors. Get to know them. Say an encouraging word. Give a phone call, an email, a text. Some way to contact others. For that will lead us to have a joyous and a blessed Thanksgiving, because we are to be so grateful that God has given us these things. We've made peace with God through Christ. We've been reconciled to him, and we are grateful for his grace. And with that, we can then give thanksgiving to God and ask him to be a blessing to us at this season. And I would want you to say that with that, we recognize that just like in this scene behind me, you see the friendship between the native and the English. So we should ask God to do the same this year with all our neighbors and others. God bless you, and may you go in peace. And this year, may you have a blessed Thanksgiving.